So by discovery-led, what we mean is that the way we make decisions needs to be adapted to the balance of the knowledge landscape. And specifically by balance, we mean the balance between what we know, our knowns, what we don't know, our unknowns, and what we think we know, our assumptions. And I'm just going to read a quote from Mark Twain to illustrate this point about assumptions. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. So it's those assumptions where you know you're right, you know the truth, and you're wrong. That's what kills you. So, what does that mean more specifically? So when we're in a world where we know little, we would argue that what you should do is you should learn. And how do you learn? You experiment. And specifically, experimentation and learning is about figuring out, getting very clear about your unknowns and your assumptions, and then testing them with just enough experiments, not being too perfectionist, but doing just enough to say, okay, I was wrong there, or I figured out something. And the balance here is between moving to action quickly, not overanalyzing the situation. Analysis or paralysis by analysis. It's actually trying to move away from that to say, no, try stuff out, see what works, see what actually works rather than what you think works. And through that process, hopefully you learn, and what all learning is turning assumptions and unknowns into knowns. That's all it is. So when you know a little bit more, and when you know more about the world, what should you do? We argue that you should scale. And what does scaling mean? It means do more of what works. That's all it is. Do more of what works. In a way, it's just common sense. But by scaling, we don't just mean an operational sort of scaling of do more, just make more books, make more tables, make more cameras. It's not just that, though that's an important part. It's also about the business model coupled with the management model. And by management model, we mean how do we do things? How do we behave? How do we lead? How do we manage? How do we figure out what we do and what we don't do? So you have experimentation when you know little, and you have scaling when you know more. There's a third piece to this. There's a really fundamental trap in this really confusing world that we're living in, and this is the trap of solving the wrong problem precisely. And this is the trap that really established successful organizations fall into. So we would argue what you should do is actually slow down sometimes and say, so really, what's the right question here? What's actually going on here? Slow down, reflect, look up, look around, try and figure out what's really going on, and try and figure out what's the right question to be answering. And we call that framing. So discovery-led is a balance between framing, experimenting, and scaling. And for leaders to sort of find the right balance between those three different types of decision making, depending on the situation they're in. So what does that mean in practice? So we believe that what you should do when you know little about the world is you should learn. That makes sense, doesn't it? And by learning, we specifically call it experimenting. And by learning, we mean taking those many unknowns and many assumptions you have. First of all, being clear about what you don't know and what you think you know. And then explicitly turning those into tests, into experiments about, we think we know that, are we right? Especially if that assumption is foundational to our strategy. So you experiment, you test. And we would argue that what you should do is move from action, or move into action specifically, more quickly. So there's this phrase, paralysis through analysis. We would argue very strongly in this domain, experimentation means analyze less actually and move faster into action, and then come back and analyze using real data as opposed to just things you think are true. Okay, so that's experimentation. Hopefully, as you can see, learning in this context just simply means converting your unknowns and your assumptions into knowns. So hopefully, when you're learning, you learn more and you know more. So what should you do when you know more? Well, we'd say you should do more of what works. We call it scaling. And scaling specifically isn't just the operational side of doing more of printing books, building cameras, selling cameras, etc. It's not just the business model, it's the management model. And by management model, I mean, how do you lead differently in scaling compared to experimentation? And by that means you need to behave differently around risk, around failure, around learning. It's a different form of learning, actually. And there are different ways of doing more. You can do more. I talked earlier about hardwiring and softwiring. Some organizations lean more on the hardwiring to scale and some more on the softwiring. And actually both approaches work as long as you're clear about which one you're doing and you do it systematically. Okay, so you're experimenting, you're scaling, there are different disciplines, there are different types of decision making. There's a third piece to this, which is really around back to this environment that we're in, this fast-moving, confusing environment. And a big trap for organizations in this environment is that you solve the wrong problem precisely. And you can see this increasingly with a lot of large organizations, where their discipline and their rigor gets them to develop a perfect solution to a problem that doesn't really exist or is not relevant. So we would argue what you should do is actually slow down and just look around and try and make sense of what's going on in the environment and figure out what's really going on here and what's the right question to ask. And we call it framing. So discovery-led is a balance between framing, experimenting, and scaling.